Good evening and welcome to the Abandonment webinar. My name is Polly Rivers, I'm from the Landlord University. You might have been expecting Adam Mayle. Unfortunately, he can't join us this evening. He's away on paternity leave now. So I'm here instead, and I'm joined tonight by Richard Blanco, who is the NLA Rep for London. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about abandonment. So I'll pass you over to Richard to explain a little bit more.
Hello, good evening, Polly. Very nice to see you and nice to be here. Just by way of introduction, to say a little bit about myself. I'm a London-based landlord. I've been a landlord for about 14 years now, and I've got properties across 6 London boroughs. And I'm often at NLA meetings. People may well have seen me doing presentations and so on across the capital. And also I produce and present the NLA podcast, which is called Inside Property, which we put out once a month. So it's great to be joining you today on the webinar as well.
Fantastic, thank you for coming. So Richard, abandonment is one of those topics that I think is quite misunderstood on occasion. So just to clarify, what exactly is abandonment? How do you know that your property has been abandoned?
Well, that's the million-dollar question in many ways, because generally as a landlord we want things to be pretty clear in terms of when the tenancy begins and when the tenancy ends. Abandonment really is when the tenant appears to have left without informing us. But of course the tenant has exclusive possession of the property during the period of the tenancy. And so we can't just kind of open the door and go in there and see if they're there without taking some sort of vital steps really to make sure we cover ourselves.
So what steps would you have to take in order to make sure that you're not doing anything you shouldn't be doing?
Well, usually there'd be a few signs that the tenant might be abandoning. So they may be in arrears, we may have lost contact with them, maybe they're not answering phone calls or responding to emails. So I would probably start off by writing or emailing them saying that I'd like to come over to carry out a periodic inspection, routine inspection, and give them 24, 48 hours, a bit longer if you can, but 24 hours is enough. And then if I suspected they'd moved out, I would try and go over with somebody else that I've got a witness. When you arrive at the property, just have a scout around and see whether it looks like they've gone. If there are obvious signs of them being there, then of course knock on the door and ask to speak to them. But peering through the letterbox, looking through the window, is there any rubbish outside the property? Speaking to neighbours potentially to see if neighbours have seen them recently. All those are kind of ways of ascertaining whether or not the tenant's still there. If you're pretty sure that there are quite a few signs that they're not, then open the door. I hope your key still works and they haven't changed the locks. And before you go in, say, hello, it's Richard, it's the landlord, or whatever your name is, and just check whether or not they're in there, of course. Give them a few moments. And then, go in and have a look around the property, again, ideally with your witness. And then the sorts of things we're looking for, is there a pile of post on the doormat, because, they haven't been there and haven't opened it for a while. Maybe there's, if there's rubbish in the property, does it look like it's been there for a while? Is the fridge empty, or if there's stuff in the fridge, is it past its sell-by date? Have a look in the wardrobes as well, is there bed linen on the bed, sure. Clothes and stuff like that. And do take pictures so that you've got some evidence of what you saw. So that would be the first stage, really. Now, if you believe you've got enough evidence to suggest that the property has been abandoned, then you can put a notice on the door saying, I believe that the property has been abandoned. If it hasn't and you return to the property and wish to enter, then please contact this number and I'd be happy to reinstate access to the property as soon as possible.
Is that an official notice or is it just a document that you can draw up yourself?
That's actually just a document that you can draw up yourself. Now, it's not legally watertight in the sense that we don't have a court order to take possession of the property, but it's a sensible precaution to put that on the door. Maybe you're changing the locks as well because you want to re-secure the property. I think, it's reasonable for a property owner, if they're concerned that their property has been abandoned, to try to secure it. And obviously you want to make the tenant aware of how they can re-enter.
Would it be useful in that instance as well to follow up with an email, so you've got a sort of a digital paper trail as well, just to say that you've done that? just so you know the belt and braces approach?
Definitely, we definitely need an audit trail all the way, and try and contact them, contact a guarantor if there is one, contact any addresses that you've ever had for them, any phone numbers or emails. Do a bit of digging around to try and get in touch with them, because ultimately your ideal scenario is to actually speak to them and for them to actually surrender the tenancy if they have moved out, and ultimately the ideal way to do that would be through some sort of deed where they hereby declare that they've surrendered the tenancy, and to get the keys back from them so that things are clear.
So if you get to the stage where you're entering the property and you believe they've abandoned it, is there anything that you can't do at that stage? So once you've let yourself into the property and you believe that it's abandoned, there's no food in the fridge, there's no clothes in the wardrobe, are you then back in your property for all intents and purposes? Are you sort of able to change the locks, shut the windows, act as if it's your property again?
Well, you've got to act with caution, because you don't have a possession order which would give you clear rights to be in there. So there's a period when really you'd have to wait and see if the tenant gets back in touch with you. Now, the watertight way to do this would be to serve a Section 21 or Section 8 notice on the tenant then, and wait for that to expire, then go through the court proceedings and get a possession order. But of course that can take several months. So it's much better if you can try and contact the tenant. Now the other thing to say is, don't suddenly hire a skip and clear everything out the next day, because we need to wait a period to see if the tenant gets back in touch. And if you did, if it was found that you had forced the tenant out against their will, then potentially that is a criminal act, and the tenant is protected under the Protection from Eviction Act 1977. So we need to be careful that we're not seen to be harassing the tenant or throwing them out against their will.
And as a criminal act, I mean, what are you likely to be? What sort of criminal offence are you committing in that instance? Is it an unlawful eviction?
Yes, it would be. What would happen is the tenant would complain to the local authority. Mm-hmm. The local authority would serve notice on the landlord. Ultimately, the landlord can be fined or imprisoned. So, it is quite serious. Yes.
So Section 21's worth the time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yes, it could be. I mean, I had a situation actually where I was talking to the tenant about them moving out, so I knew that they might be likely to move out. I had served a Section 21 notice, but they suddenly moved out unexpectedly, and there were absolutely no belongings left in the property. And in fact, they left the front door open. So, so it depends on the situation. But again, I had to put a notice on the front door there, and I did then manage to meet up with the tenant, and they handed over the keys, and that's an act of surrender. So if you can also get them to sign to say that they've surrendered the tenancy, that's helpful too.
So would that then have been the deed of surrender that you received?
If they were handing over the keys, what I'd probably want is some sort of receipt, where we write down that they've handed over the keys and they've given up the tenancy, they've surrendered the tenancy. But you can have a kind of formal deed of surrender, which is where the tenant would say that they surrender the tenancy, and the landlord would say that they accept the surrender, and then both of you would sign that, and a witness would sign to say that they've seen.
And that's a complete finish. That finishes the tenancy at whatever stage of proceedings it is.
That does.
That can be done a week into a tenancy if it needs to be.
It could be, yes. Yeah, if you've ever had one of those situations where a tenant wants to move out early, or perhaps they can't pay the rent and you want them to move out early, or you've suggested that and they've accepted that as a way of resolving the issue, then a deed of surrender could be used in that circumstance.
If you can't get hold of the tenant, if they've abandoned the property, they've gone, but you're able to get in touch with the guarantor, would they be able to do a deed of surrender on the tenant's behalf?
No, I don't think the guarantor can do a deed of surrender on the tenant's behalf. I think it has to be the tenant. I mean, the guarantor certainly has joint liability for things like the rent, the payment of the rent, and that's helpful because if you say to the guarantor, the tenant appears to have abandoned the premises. If I'm going to do this in a legally watertight way, I'm going to have to go through the Section 21 process, which is going to take several months, and you're going to have to pay the rent potentially, then that of course does encourage the guarantor to find the tenant.
Well, they like you to have a rough idea of where they are, more so than you possibly, aren't they?
Yeah, that's the whole benefit, of course, of having a guarantor, particularly if they're related to the tenant.
So, if your tenant decides to leave midway through the tenancy and abandon your property, do they have any legal rights if they choose to come back? So if you've gone in and you've checked their wardrobe and put a notice on the door, what if they then decide actually they do want to live there and they come back?
Yes, I mean they do, and certainly that notice that we would put on the door saying, if you wish to re-enter the property, please contact me, it's a serious one. So, if 2 or 3 days later after putting the notice up, the tenant said, hang on, I've just gone on a long holiday and I want to come back, then, you must make yourself available as quickly as possible and let them back in. If you didn't, then they would be protected under the Protection from Eviction Act. So you're not allowed to deprive a residential occupier of the right to occupation of the premises, and as I've said, it is a criminal offence to do that. So the tenant does have the right to occupy. They have exclusive possession of the property during the period of the tenancy.
And if you chose to then say issue a Section 21 on that tenant, obviously if the relationship has been soured in any way or something along those lines, would they have any claims against you? So would they be able to say again that there's been harassment or anything like that? Would those actions count as negative against you?
No, not with a Section 21, because it's a no-fault procedure. If something like repairs has come up, or if, I guess actually just thinking through it, if the local authority had served a notice on you because you had tried to prevent their occupation of the premises, then that could prevent you from serving a Section 21 notice because of the retaliatory eviction provisions in the Deregulation Act. So yes, that's true. So potentially that could cause you problems, yeah. But I mean, ideally you would never want to get to that stage, yes, where the local authority is serving a notice on you.
I suppose at that point it's probably worth sitting down, having a cup of tea and a chat with them and saying, look, is this likely to happen again? Can you give me a heads up if you're going on a long holiday, or just so I don't think that you've abandoned the property? That's
actually a really important point, Polly. I mean, this whole business about sitting down and talking to the tenant, and I know all of my tenants, by name. I know a bit about all of my tenants' lives and what's going on for them, and it's, I feel that we have a good relationship and they can talk to me about stuff, whenever they need to, and I think that's really important.
It's a useful thing to be able to do, isn't it? I mean, knowing if people are what people are going through, and obviously life happens, doesn't it? So it's perfectly acceptable.
Exactly.
For that to happen, and you can't always assume that it's an abandonment if it is just an extended holiday or something. It's not necessarily always best to jump to that conclusion.
The other issue there is insurance, of course, and lots of tenancies will say that the tenant should inform the landlord if they're away for a certain period. I think the NLA tenancy says if you're away for 14 days or more, inform the landlord. Some insurance policies require notification after a certain period if the tenant's or if the property is unoccupied. Often it's 30 days. And some insurance policies might even put you onto what's called flea insurance, which is fire, lightning, explosion or aircraft collision only insurance if the property is unoccupied for more than 30 days. So you do need to keep an eye on that.
And is that something you can build into your tenancy agreement? That obviously if it's in the NLA tenancy agreement, that's the one that I know Urban use, and I know a lot of people listening will probably be using that one as well. So if it's not in your tenancy agreement, is that something you can put in as a clause that would stand up?
Yes, I mean, let's think, would it help you with abandonment? Not necessarily, but I think very often these clauses in the tenancy agreement, if the tenant reads through it thoroughly, it just makes them aware that they should be doing stuff. I mean, the NLA contract, for example, says that tenants must not light candles, and I hadn't realised that until a tenant said, "Oh, Richard, we just wanted to let you know that we've got some candles that we're using for a dinner party. Is that okay?" And I had it, yes. So you'd be surprised, and a lot of tenants read the contract in detail and then take what's said in there seriously. It is seriously, and it's meant seriously. So yeah.
I suppose it's the tenancy agreement is there to to support you and the tenant. So, I mean, if there's a clause in there that's saying to notify your landlord if you're going away for an extended period, then hopefully, if it isn't abandonment, if it is just a long holiday, then that would sort of hopefully let you know. But
yes, I mean, I have quite a few Romanian tenants actually in 3 of my houses, and they tend to go back to Romania in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
August is a big month for weddings. Weddings are a big thing in Romania, and so you know, at least one of my Romanian tenants has said we're going away for the whole of August, and they do let me know in advance, you know, so it's helpful to be told, and I can then drive past the property and just check it's okay. Yeah.
One of the questions that we've had in for people in the run up to this is what's the situation that you face when if a tenant goes to prison? Obviously, it's not something you aim for. It's not something your tenants are aiming for, presumably.
But life happens.
So obviously, it could potentially be for an extended period. If they're able to keep paying the rent, but they're obviously not going to be in the property, what then?
Yes, I mean, if they're able to keep paying the rent, maybe that they've gone to prison just for a few weeks, and you know they will want to have a property they can come back to afterwards. Sometimes I think benefit can be paid at a certain rate as well whilst somebody's in prison. Then they retain the right to maintain the tenancy. But you know, if they've been banged up for 5 years, poor souls.
Somewhat different.
Then I would recommend getting in touch with them and saying, you know, would you like to surrender your tenancy? Obviously, you are liable for paying rent until you do, and come to some arrangement with them. If you're not able to come to an arrangement with them, then you would just have to go through the standard Section 21 or Section 8 process to end the tenancy.
So again, it's using a deed of surrender, ideally. And is that something that the prison service would be able to help sort of support you through?
Well, you would hope so.
Doing a visitation right to get them signed a deed of surrender would be quite
It could be. It could be. I mean, you don't have to do a deed of surrender. You could do it by email, or you know, I could write to the tenant saying, thanks for speaking to me the other day. You know, I understand that you are, you know, spending a period of time in prison, and we've agreed that you will surrender the tenancy from this date. Please, would you sign and return a copy of this to me? You know, that's not as watertight as a deed of surrender, but you know, it's you know, more or less there. I would suspect that, you know, a judge would accept that as fairly watertight.
And I mean, that instance certainly might be the case, but in any instance of abandonment, what do you do if your tenant has potentially left some possessions behind, and they've abandoned the property? You're fairly confident that it's been abandoned, but they've left possessions there. Do you have a responsibility for storing them, and how long for? I mean, what would you do?
Yes, this is a bit of a bone of contention because, you know, I've had tenants leave wardrobes and beds and mattresses and all kinds of things that, you know, are theirs, and you know, the tenant has moved abroad and they just don't want to have to deal with it. And unfortunately, you do have to keep them for a certain amount of time. What I would recommend is take photos of them, email to the tenant. Obviously, if the tenant's vanished and you can't do that, that's tricky. But I would still email it to the last address and email it to the guarantor, etc. Some people advise that you keep possessions up for up to 3 months. Now, you know,
it's a sofa, isn't it?
It is, yes. The law around this says, you know, whatever's reasonable. The advice that's often given is if the person is in arrears, then 28 days is long enough. I tend to say to the tenant in a checkout letter that please remember to take all of your belongings. If you don't, I will normally keep them for a reasonable period, usually about 14 days, and I'll contact you, try and get you to come and take them. But if you haven't taken them after that, then, you know, I may dispose of them. Whether a court of law would see that as reasonable, but, you know, I don't have anywhere to store them, and, you know, I'm sure lots of landlords don't. So it's basically about doing whatever you think is reasonable. But try and contact the tenant through as many channels as you can, you know, that's the thing.
If you've got a guarantor contact details and can you pass the buck to them? I mean, is that something they can do? I mean, I'm passing the buck to a guarantor an awful lot, isn't it?
Yes,
I'm afraid,
poor old guarantor.
they're taking an awful lot of responsibility. But I mean, if it's a family member, I mean, if I was that person, if I abandoned a property, I'd want my things given to my family member. But not that I would. But it's I'm just sort of trying to think of what I would want in that situation, and is the guarantor liable? Would they, or is it just
they could be
possible?
Well, they could be
option?
liable for a storage charge. I mean, that's
Okay.
one way of dealing with it. Saying to the guarantor, the tenant has left 4 wardrobes, 3 sofas, and a mattress, and it's going to cost £200 a month to store these. You know, I am required to store them for a reasonable period. What would you like to do? And they know that they could be ultimately liable for that charge, so they might want to take responsibility. It depends what it is, doesn't it? Because if it's a few items of jewellery or something like that, then obviously it's easy to store. I've had a situation where the tenant left a duvet and pillowcases and pillows and bed linen. So I just stored it in a black sack in my own home for 6 months, and I never heard from the tenant again, and that was that. So it just depends what it is.
It's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one, isn't it? Yes, yeah. I mean, I had another situation where a tenant did leave loads of wardrobes and furniture and stuff, and they got a friend to help me deal with them and dispose of them. We agreed that a charity shop would take them. The charity shop wouldn't take them because they were too horrible and in terrible condition. So I ended up smashing them to pieces and getting,
Would be quite satisfying.
yes, a Junk and Disorderly, which is a kind of rubbish collection agency, to take them away. But before I did that, I had sent pictures. I had been in constant correspondence.
Doing the audit trail, so you're covered.
Yes.
So I understand there's a bit of legislation coming into play. There's ums and ahs as to when it's coming in, isn't there? That's going to be changing the abandonment scene somewhat. I understand.
Yes, it's Part 3 of the Housing and Planning Act 2016. It's where the tenant owes rent, and they need to be 8 weeks in arrears for you to be able to use this procedure. But what you'll be able to do is serve what's called a first warning notice, which requires the tenant to respond within 8 weeks. It's actually the tenant or deposit payer. You then serve a second notice during that 8-week period, and what you do with the notice is you obviously try and send it to all of the addresses that you've got for the tenant, to the guarantor, if there is a guarantor, email, send it in writing, etc. If you still haven't heard from the tenant after the second warning notice, which has to be sent between 2 to 4 weeks after the first warning, then you can send a third warning notice, and you must affix that to a conspicuous part of the property, and do that at least 5 days before the end of the 8-week period. So that's basically saying that the property your tenancy will be deemed to have ended at the end of that 8-week period if you don't get in touch.
So it's almost like a Section 21, but specifically for abandonment.
It is, yes. So basically, at the end of that 8-week period, if the tenant has not got in touch, then the tenancy is deemed to have ended. The tenant can appeal. I think they've got a 6-month period in which to appeal. So if they do suddenly reappear after their 3-month holiday in Australia, then there is that risk that they could the tenancy could be reinstated.
At that point, you'd then be able to pop a Section 8 in place, because presumably they wouldn't have been paying rent during the 2 months prior, the 2 months during, and then at any point during the 6 months up to the appeal process as well.
I would suggest, yes, that when you issue the first warning notice, you also issue a Section 8 or a Section 21, so at least you've got that in process. Section 21 ideally, of course, because then it's no fault and you've got that 2-month period.
So you can issue multiple notices. You can issue the other notices as well as this one. It's not either or.
You can definitely issue a Section 21. I must admit, I'm not absolutely sure if you can issue a Section 8.
Until it comes in, I suppose everything's supposed to change, isn't it?
I guess probably you would have to if it was during the fixed period, because you can't issue a Section 21. No. So I would imagine you can issue a Section 8 or a Section 21 at the same time.
Until it comes in, everything's up in the air to a certain extent.
Yes,
We'll
we
have
will
to
eventually
wait with bated breath
all get our
until
heads around it at some point, yes.
Yeah, well, watch this space. We'll obviously keep you up, the NLA, of course, and us and Landlord University will keep you updated as soon as it becomes active and usable. So do bear with us, and as soon as it does, we'll keep you updated on that one. But so currently, Section 8, Section 21 is the way forward, or a deed of surrender if you can get hold of the tenant to ask them to do that. And obviously when this new piece of legislation becomes law and active, then that's the way forward.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So the worst has happened and your property's been abandoned and you've got to go through the process of regaining possession. How do I do that? What do I have to do?
Yes, I mean, we're back to good old Section 21 or Section 8, really. The point here, of course, is as soon as you suspect the property might have been abandoned, then do serve those notices ASAP, because obviously with Section 21 you've got that 2-month period before you can actually apply for a possession order, and with Section 8 you've got the 14 days generally notice that you have to give until you start court proceedings. So the sooner you serve the notice, the better. You would use the Section 8 if you were in a fixed term, so say you've given the tenant a 6-month or 12-month tenancy agreement and the property appears to have been abandoned within that fixed term, then you need to use Section 8. Unless you're coming to the end of the, if you're just 2 months from the end of the tenancy agreement, then you could use Section 21. And if it's the tenancy has gone periodic, so beyond the fixed period, then you can use Section 21. Now, it's always better to use Section 21, I think, because it's no fault. Mm-hmm. The danger with Section 8 is that the judge may decide that the tenant hasn't abandoned the property, or the tenant might suddenly pay some rent at the last minute. That means that you've lost mandatory grounds for possession. It goes into discretionary. So where possible, use Section 21. Some people say they'd rather use Section 8 because if the tenant owes rent as well, you do get a money order with Section 8. So the possession order will say the tenant must pay X amount of money that they owe. But, if you do Section 1, you can do a small claims procedure to claim the rent owed as well.
Are you able to do that even without knowing where the tenant is? Without affording address, without having a clue where to look? Is that your problem?
Well, yes, I mean, that's the good point, because you have to serve notices at the last known address. And of course, if the last known address is, the property that you think they've abandoned, the issue whenever you're trying to claim money from someone is you need to consider how likely you are to get it back. And certainly when I had a tenant abandon a property, I think something like £430 was owed, and I didn't even bother trying to claim it because I just thought,
how likely am I to get this? Exactly.
So you need to make that judgment. That was a studio flat, and there was about less than a month's rent owed. But if we're talking about a 4-bed house, and even if it's 1 month owed in London, then it could be £2,000 or more. So that's a judgment call you need to make. I suppose what we're trying to do is prevent abandonment in the first place. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing periodic inspections, if you're staying in touch with the tenant, then you can pick up if something's going wrong, and get a sense of what's going on in their life, really. And all of those things make it harder for them to abandon, I think. If they know you as a person, if they know there's a bit of a relationship there, then they're less likely to just walk out of your property and leave you with the situation, I think.
If you've got a property that's been abandoned and you're going through the process of regaining possession, what situation are you in with regards to reletting that property? Presumably, even though it's been abandoned and you're fairly confident that the tenant is gone, presumably you can't even contemplate reletting that property or advertising that property until you've completely regained possession or got the deed of surrender.
Well, if you're wanting to be completely watertight, that's absolutely right. Wait till you've got the deed of surrender or a possession order. Yes, I guess, there is this business of implied surrender where, there's a body of evidence that suggests the tenant has left. And in legal terms, it would be the actions are not consistent with those of someone who wants to continue being a tenant. So there's a pile of post, there's out-of-date food in the fridge, there are no clothes left in the wardrobe, neighbours haven't seen them for some time.
I just saw a removals van pulling away last week.
That kind of thing. But you do run the risk, of course, of reletting the property, and then the tenant gets in touch with you and says, "Hang on, I haven't moved out." So that's a judgment call you'd have to make, really. And of course, any solicitor would say to you, never relet a property until you've got a deed of surrender or you've got a possession order.
Could you look to? I mean, I know certainly in certain towns and cities, properties move so quickly. But if you were possibly looking at advertising a property and you've got a Section 21 due to expire in a month's time, would you be able to advertise it as becoming available in a month's
definitely.
time? Is that acceptable?
Voids are very costly. I mean, particularly in London for landlords, you want to get the property turned around as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. So I would definitely be advertising it. I mean, remember that once you've found a suitable tenant, it could be 3 or 4 weeks before they can move in anyway, by which time, you might have got your possession order. So I guess the onus again is on you to try and find that tenant, and if you can just meet them and get them to hand over the keys, or if you can just agree with them that they'll drop the keys off at the letting agent or something like that, just so that you've got something concrete that says that they've
and back everything
surrendered.
up with emails and paper trails, so you're covering your back.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you. Oh, so in short, just belt and braces, cover everything with emails, don't do your level best to keep in touch, and wherever possible try and build that relationship with your tenants so they don't want to abandon you in the first place.
Absolutely, no landlord wants to be abandoned.
No one wants to be abandoned, especially not at Christmas. No one wants to be abandoned at Christmas. Okie dokie, well, I think we're going to be answering questions. We've hopefully answered a few, and all further questions are going to be answered on the Landlord University blog post that will go up in the next few days. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and hopefully we'll be able to have you again soon here to do another webinar.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Polly, and good luck to all of those landlords out there who have issues with abandonment.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.